Hi guys! Let's begin with the most elegant lie ever sold by history, that kings were clean. They weren't. They were glorified compost heaps with fancy hats. The truth? The royal chamber pot wasn't emptied with dignity. It was tipped straight into the moat. And not because someone forgot where the bin was, no, it was policy. Official, sealed, stamped, probably blessed by a nervous monk. You think a moat keeps out invaders? Try a moat thick with yesterday's soup, last night's wine, and the king's personal contribution to national defense. That wasn't sewage, that was strategy. If a knight swam through that and still wanted to fight, he deserved the throne. Honestly, it was the medieval version of a do not enter sign, but with more smell and fewer words. Imagine, if you will, a grand castle. Tall towers, fluttering banners, the sun glinting off stained glass. And beneath it all, bubbling gently like a witch's stew, the moat, rich with centuries of royal waste. They didn't call it the water feature back then, but they should have. It wasn't just water. It was a cocktail. Aged urine, fermented slop, the occasional lost slipper. Ducks avoided it. Fish floated belly up, not from poison, but from sheer disappointment. And yet, the king would stand on his balcony, sniff the air, and say, "Ah, spring." Either he was mad, or he'd been breathing this for so long that fresh air would have knocked him over like a slap. The thing is, they didn't see it as dirty. They saw it as power. The more you could afford to let rot around you, the more important you were. Peasants washed. That was common. Kings? They transcended washing. Their smell was a statement. I am so high above you, it said, that I don't even need to pretend I'm not standing in my own leftovers. A visiting noble once fainted during dinner. Not from the food, though that was questionable, but from the Lord's armpits, which apparently had their own weather system. They carried him outside, revived him with vinegar, and then praised the host for his robust presence. That's the key word, presence. In more ways than one. And the servants? Oh, they were the real heroes. Picture a young boy, no older than 12, carrying a silver chamber pot through 3 echoing halls, past tapestries, past guards, past ladies who pretended not to notice. But they noticed. Everyone noticed. The pot wasn't heavy, but the weight of it, the knowledge that he held the king's most private moment in his hands, that was crushing. And he had to walk slowly, gracefully, like he wasn't holding a biological weapon. If he stumbled, that wasn't just a spill. That was treason. Or at least, that's what the head steward said while kicking him down the stairs later. But the boy didn't complain. He was proud. He was part of the royal machine. He helped maintain the aroma of authority. You'd think someone would have suggested a better system. A drain, perhaps. A pipe. Something. But no. Water was suspicious. Cleanliness was linked to vanity, and vanity was one step away from sin. Also, pipes cost money, and money was better spent on hats with feathers so long they required their own room. Besides, if you built a proper toilet, where would the rats live? The castle needed balance. Rats in the walls, waste in the moat, prayers in the chapel, it was a full ecosystem. God made the world, but man made the smell, and frankly, man was winning. The best part? They thought it kept them safe. Not just the moat, but the smell itself. Bad air, or miasma, as they dramatically called it, caused disease, they believed. So, if the air was already terrible, adding more couldn't hurt. It was like saying, well, the house is on fire, might as well light a cigarette. They'd wave herbs around, burn rosemary, hang stinking bundles of wormwood from the rafters, all to purify air that hadn't been pure since the Romans left. It didn't work, of course. But it smelled different, and different felt like progress. Progress that smelled like a goat's nightmare. And let's talk about the queens. Poor women. They had to sit on the same pots, breathe the same air, smile through banquets where the main course and the guest of honor competed for who reeked more. One queen reportedly kept a small bottle of vinegar under her sleeve and took delicate sips whenever the king leaned in to whisper. Not because she was thirsty, because she needed to reset her nose. Another wore a crown with tiny holes so that perfumed silk could hang down over her nostrils. Fashion with function. Or desperation with jewels. You might think, well, surely they bath sometimes? And yes, technically. But bathing in the 1200s meant sitting in a wooden tub while 3 servants argued about whether water touching the soul was a sin. They'd pour a jug over your head, declare it done, and then burn the water just in case it was corrupted. The average noble bathed once a year, usually before Christmas, unless it rained, or the stars were wrong, or someone sneezed twice in a row. Hygiene was not a science. It was a series of superstitions held together by prayer and denial. But here's the real kicker. The moat wasn't even the worst part. That honor went to the Jakes. The Jakes! Yes, that was the word. Not toilet, not privy, not even bathroom. Jakes! It sounded like a bad nickname, but no, it was the place where you sat over a hole, dangled your dignity above a pit of centuries-old filth, and hoped the wooden seat didn't give way. Some Jakes were in towers. Literally. You'd climb up, do your business, and whatever fell went down through the castle, through cracks, through history, until it joined the moat in its slow, stinking journey toward the sea. Archaeologists today find these pits and weep, not from sadness, but from memory. And yet, people lived like this. They fell in love. They wrote poetry. They went to war over who got to sit where at dinner. All while breathing air that could strip bark from trees. You start to wonder, did they even notice? Or did their noses just give up, like a dog that's been rolled in something awful and now considers it perfume? Probably the latter. After a few weeks in a castle, you stop smelling the rot. You start to miss it when it's gone. Like coming home. So next time you complain about a blocked drain or a smelly bin, remember the kings of old. They didn't have plumbers. They had tradition. And if you dared suggest a window that opened, or a bucket that didn't leak, you weren't just questioning hygiene, you were attacking the very foundation of power. The throne wasn't just guarded by knights. It was protected by stench. And honestly, it worked. No invader ever made it past the second tower. Not because of arrows. Because of the smell. And as the wind carried the royal aroma across the fields, peasants knelt, not in prayer, but in self-defense. The age of chivalry wasn't just about honor and swords. It was about holding your breath and pretending you didn't just see the king scratch where no sunlight ever reached. That was loyalty. That was medieval life. And that, my friend, was the scent of power. Here's a thought that would have made a nobleman faint into his soup: the poor smelled better than the rich. Not because they had better soap, they didn't have soap at all, but because they weren't afraid of water. While lords and ladies treated baths like dangerous religious rituals, peasants were out there in the rivers, scrubbing their arms with sand and herbs, laughing, splashing, living. They didn't write poems about it. They didn't need to. Their secret weapon wasn't perfume. It was common sense. And occasionally, a handful of mint. Imagine a summer morning in a village. The sun is warm, the birds are singing, and down by the stream, a dozen people are knee-deep in water, scrubbing clothes, hair, and themselves. They're not doing it for vanity. They're doing it because yesterday's pig dust eye job left its mark, and nobody wants to sleep next to someone who smells like a forgotten cheese. So in they go. Cold water, rough stone, maybe a bit of ash from the fire to help with the grease. It's not luxurious, but it works. And when they walk back to the huts, damp and shivering, they leave behind a trail of something almost pleasant: wet earth, crushed time, human skin that hasn't given up. Now, contrast that with the lord of the manor, sitting in his hall, wrapped in velvet, sweating through 3 layers of wool, refusing to bathe because he's heard, from a monk who once read half a sentence from a Greek book, that water opens the pores to disease. Not just any disease. All disease. Especially the kind that comes from being clean. Yes, really. They believed that. Not metaphorically. Literally. If you washed too much, the air would sneak in through your skin and fill your body with bad humors, which would then turn into fever, or madness, or worse, commoners. And nothing scared the nobility more than accidentally smelling like someone who worked for a living. So instead of water, they used workarounds. A splash of vinegar behind the ears. A dab of rosewater on the temples. A little bag of dried lavender tucked into the armpit. They called it a pomander, which sounded fancy, but was basically a medieval deodorant made by someone who'd never actually smelt a real armpit. Some pomanders were even made of silver, shaped like apples or skulls, because nothing says I'm fresh like wearing a tiny metal corpse under your arm. The idea was that the herbs would ward off bad air. In reality, they mostly just added a floral note to the existing symphony of sweat, old wine, and despair. And yet, the poor, those dirty, ragged, washed poor, were the ones who actually smelled all right. Not like roses. Not like anything you'd want to bottle. But not like a crime scene, either. They used what they had. Sunlight. Wind. Smoke from the fire. A roll in the grass after rain. They didn't have perfumers, but they had instinct. They knew that if you slept near a cow, you'd smell like a cow. So they didn't. They knew that if you boiled your clothes in herbs, they wouldn't just be cleaner, they'd smell like dinner, which was better than smelling like last week's dinner still stuck to you. The irony? The rich looked down on them for being unclean. They used words like filthy and reeking to describe peasants, not because they were dirty, but because they weren't like them. To a noble, clean skin was suspicious. It suggested independence. It suggested you didn't need servants to carry your waste. It suggested you might be too healthy, which was basically a personality flaw in a time when illness was a sign of divine attention. If you never got sick, people started to wonder, are you even trying to be holy? There's a story, probably made up, but feels true, about a visiting count who rode into a village and immediately covered his nose with a silk cloth soaked in musk. "Good heavens," he said, "what is that smell?" And the villagers looked at each other, confused. Because to them, it was just air. Fresh. With a hint of baking bread, wood smoke, and the distant promise of onions. But to the Count, it was chaos. It wasn't controlled stench. It wasn't layered, like in a castle, where you had the base note of mildew, the middle of fermented rushes, and the top of human breath that hadn't been cleaned since the Crusades. No, this was natural. And nature, to a nobleman, was just God's first draft. Still, the poor didn't brag about their hygiene. They didn't need to. They lived in a world where function beat fashion. If your feet stank, you washed them. If your shirt reeked, you boiled it. If your neighbor smelled bad, you told them, politely, and offered a sprig of sage. No drama. No theology. Just life. Meanwhile, in the castle, they were holding debates about whether bathing on a Tuesday might anger the saints. One bishop claimed that regular washing led to lustful thoughts. Another said it weakened the soul. A third, more practical one, just said, "I tried it once and my wig fell off, and that was enough to ban it for another 50 years. And let's talk about hair. Noble hair was a fortress. Layers of grease, powder, pins, and prayers held it in place for weeks. Washing it? Out of the question. It would take days to rebuild. So instead, they covered it. Wimples, veils, hats with feathers that could blind a horse. The goal wasn't beauty, it was containment. Keep the smell in, the bugs out, and the illusion alive. Peasants, on the other hand, cut their hair short, combed it with bones, and let the wind do the styling. And when they got lice, they dealt with it. Not with incantations, but with nit-picking and hot water. Simple. Effective. Humiliating? Maybe. But less humiliating than pretending your wig was resting when it was actually being scraped clean in a back room. The real tragedy is that this fear of water lasted for centuries. Not because there was evidence. Not because people were sick after bathing, they weren't. But because the idea took root, cleanliness is rebellion. If you wash, you're saying the world isn't filthy by design. You're saying you can improve on God's mess. And that was dangerous. So they didn't. They sweated. They itched. They waved herbs and muttered prayers and called it hygiene. And all the while, down by the river, children played in the shallows, their skin clean, their laughter loud, their smell, honestly, not far off from what you'd want in a human being. Not perfect. Not perfumed. But alive. Not hiding from the world, but part of it. They didn't fear the water. They thanked it. And when they walked back to their homes, damp and happy, the air around them was lighter. Not because of magic. Not because of status. Just because they'd had the courage to get wet. So the next time you step into a shower and think, modern luxury, remember this, the idea of washing yourself wasn't invented in the 1800s. It was remembered. Dragged back from the peasants, the riverbanks, the forgotten corners of common sense. The nobles had the money, the power, the crowns. But the poor? They had the noses. And in the end, they were the ones who knew, sometimes, the cleanest thing you can be is honest. Even if you're standing in a cold stream, shivering, with a bar of ash and a dream. And as the sun set over the fields, and the smoke rose from 100 small fires, the smell wasn't grand. It wasn't royal. But it was real. And in a world built on lies, that was the rarest perfume of all. Here's a fact that would make a saint blush: the holier the place, the worse it smelled. Cathedrals, chapels, abbeys, these were not houses of God so much as houses of mildew. The air inside wasn't just thick with prayer. It was thick with sweat, damp stone, and the quiet despair of people who'd been kneeling on cold floors since dawn. And the smell? Imagine a cellar that's been left shut for 100 years, add a few dozen wool cloaks that have never seen water, throw in a choir boy who hasn't changed his socks since Easter, and then light a bonfire of rosemary. That was divine service. That was worship. You'd think a place meant for purity would be clean. But no. The church didn't fear dirt. It feared doubt. And so, while it could ban dancing, forbid bathing, and excommunicate a man for missing Mass, it couldn't quite figure out how to stop the smell. It wasn't from sin, though they blamed that too. It was from people. Hundreds of them, packed together, breathing, sweating, praying, occasionally fainting. The pews weren't just wooden, they were seasoned. Decades of bodies pressing into the same spots, leaving behind layers of grease, hair, and something the sexton called spiritual residue. Probably best not to ask. And the stone, oh, the stone. It looked majestic. Cold, grey, carved with angels and demons and scenes of eternal punishment. But touch it, and your fingers came away damp. Not from tears of repentance. From weeping walls. The church was always wet. Rain seeped in. Breath condensed on the arches. Candles dripped wax that never hardened because the air was too thick. It wasn't a building. It was a living thing, breathing in the prayers and breathing out a fog that smelled like forgotten laundry and regret. But here's the real trick: they knew it stank. And instead of opening a window, which would have helped, they decided the problem wasn't the air. The problem was that the air wasn't holy enough. So they burned incense. Not a little. Not just on special days. They burned it like it was going out of fashion, which, in a way, it never did. Thick, greasy smoke curled up to the rafters, clinging to the frescoes, staining the saints' faces a gentle yellow. The idea was that the sweet smell would drive out the bad air. In reality, it just mixed with it. Like trying to hide onions by spraying perfume on them. Now you don't just smell onions. You smell fancy onions. Incense wasn't spiritual. It was survival. The priest swung his censer like a man fending off bees, sending clouds of myrrh into the pews like a fog machine at a very serious concert. If you could still smell feet after that, you were either blessed or cursed, probably both. The congregation sat there, eyes watering, noses twitching, pretending to be moved by the sermon, while really just wondering if the smell was supposed to make them holy or make them vomit. Some wept. Not from guilt. From smoke inhalation. And the robes, don't get me started on the robes. The bishop's vestments weren't washed. They were aired, which meant they were taken outside for an hour, slapped a few times, and then put back on, still holding the essence of 100 sermons, spilled wine, and the bishop's own unique contribution to the atmosphere. They said the garments were sacred, that they carried the weight of office. They didn't say they carried the weight of mildew, but they did. You could smell a bishop coming from down the street. Not because of his entourage, because of his aroma. It was a mix of beeswax, old bread, and something vaguely fungal. People knelt not just out of respect, but because the smell hit lower first. Confessionals were worse. Tiny wooden boxes where sinners whispered their darkest secrets into a grill while breathing air that had been recycled since the Black Death. The priest sat on one side, sweating in his cassock, listening to tales of lust, greed, and sheep theft, all while trying not to pass out from the combination of guilt and body odor. Some priests kept a sprig of mint in their sleeve. Others just held their breath. A few developed a twitch. It wasn't the sins that got to them. It was the aftermath, the lingering scent of a man who'd walked 10 miles through a pig field to get there, then lied about it. And yet, they called this purity. They said the church was a place of light, of truth, of divine presence. And maybe it was. But it was also a place where a single open window was seen as a threat to faith. Let in fresh air? A monk once said, scandalized. And let in demons? Next you'll want to scrub the altar. Because, of course, cleaning was suspicious. If something was too clean, it might not be holy. Holiness, in those days, came with a certain grit. A certain dampness. A certain smell that made you feel small, unworthy, and slightly nauseous. That was the point. If you walked out feeling better, you hadn't suffered enough. The irony? The people who came to church to escape the filth of the world were walking into the filthiest room in town. The market stank, yes. The stables reeked, absolutely. But at least there, the smell made sense. Here, it was sacred. They didn't clean the floors because dirt showed humility. They didn't wash the altar cloths because stains proved devotion. One abbey even kept a puddle in the corner of the chapel to remind the brothers of their mortality. It wasn't just damp. It was alive. Frogs were rumored. No one confirmed it. But the singing got quieter near that corner. And the candles, hundreds of them, dripping wax, burning animal fat, filling the air with a greasy film that coated everything, including the lungs. The light was soft, golden, holy. The air was thick, yellow, and tasted like a roast that had gone slightly wrong. People said they felt closer to God in that glow. Maybe they did. Or maybe they were just light-headed from the fumes. Either way, it worked. Faith doesn't need fresh air. It needs atmosphere. And the church had plenty. Children were brought in as babies to be baptized, not because the water was clean, it wasn't, but because the ritual mattered more than the result. The font sat in the corner, covered in a cloth that hadn't been changed since the Reformation, was a twinkle in someone's eye. The water inside was stale, cloudy, and possibly home to a small civilization. But no one complained. To question the font was to question grace. To suggest a scrub was to suggest God couldn't handle a bit of slime. So they dipped the babies, said the words, and hoped the smell of incense would cover the smell of mildew clinging to the infant's blanket. And outside, the world carried on. The sun shone. The rivers ran. The peasants washed in the streams, laughed, lived. But inside, the doors stayed shut. The windows stayed closed. The smoke kept rising. Because to let in fresh air was to let in doubt. And in a time when faith was everything, the last thing you wanted was to breathe too deeply and realize what you were really kneeling in. So the church stood, grand and grey, its bells calling the faithful, its spires pointing to heaven, its insides quietly rotting. Not from neglect. From devotion. They kept the stink because they thought it kept the soul. They burned incense, not to smell nice, but to pretend they weren't drowning in the smell of themselves. And every Sunday, the people came, knelt, prayed, and left carrying the scent with them, a little whiff of holiness, a little whiff of damp, and the quiet understanding that sometimes, the closest you get to God is when you can no longer smell your own life. And as the last hymn faded and the doors creaked shut, the building settled. The candles flickered. The smoke curled. And somewhere, deep in the walls, a drop of water fell. Not from rain. From the ceiling. From the roof. From the sky. From the world outside, where the air was free and clean and completely, utterly ignored. Here's the romantic truth no troubadour ever sang. The man writing a poem about a lady's eyes like stars was probably sitting in a room that smelled like fermented cabbage and yesterday's regret. And the lady? She was breathing through her mouth, hoping her suitor wouldn't get too close. Because love in the 1200s wasn't about passion. It was about positioning. Standing downwind. Smiling politely. Pretending you couldn't smell the knight's helmet hair after 3 days of wearing it to bed. Courtly love wasn't romance. It was olfactory diplomacy. You've heard of love letters? They were written by men who hadn't washed their hands since they last held a sword. The ink smudged not because of tears, but because their fingers were greasy. And the paper, oh, the paper. It absorbed scent like a sponge. So when a damsel unfolded a sonnet comparing her breath to spring meadows, she was actually inhaling a mix of sweat, candle wax, and the faint tang of something that might have been garlic, or might have been despair. Still, she smiled. Because in those days, affection wasn't measured in kisses. It was measured in how long you could stand near someone without needing fresh air. The idea of romance was beautiful, on paper. Knights swore oaths on holy relics to serve their ladies from afar. They jousted. They sang. They wept into their gloves. But the reality? The closer they got, the worse it became. Imagine the scene, a grand hall, candles flickering, a lute playing softly in the corner. The knight approaches, heart pounding, eyes full of devotion. He kneels. He takes her hand. And then the wind shifts. It hits her like a sack of old turnips. Not him. Not entirely. But around him. The wool of his tunic, unwashed for weeks. The leather of his boots, still holding the memory of a stable. The faint, sour note rising from under his armpit, a place so rarely visited, some believed it had its own climate. She doesn't flinch. She's been trained for this. Instead, she fans herself gently with a scrap of silk and says, "How brave you look today, sir." Which, in the secret language of the time, meant, "Please move 3 steps to the left and never come back." They didn't talk about smell. That would have been vulgar. Instead, they used code. Your presence is powerful. You carry the strength of the wildwoods. Your aura is unmistakable. All of which meant you are emitting something that has startled the dogs. But no one admitted it. To complain about scent was to admit you noticed the body. And the body, in polite society, didn't exist. Except when it did. And then you just had to deal with it. Perfume? Oh, they tried. But perfume in the 1200s wasn't a delicate mist from a glass bottle. It was a paste. A mush. Sometimes made from crushed flowers, yes, but also from animal fat, honey, and things best left unnamed. One popular recipe called for rose petals, civet, which came from a cat's glands, no, really, and a splash of vinegar to bind the spirits. It didn't smell fresh. It smelled busy. Like a garden that had been attacked by a small animal and then set on fire. But it was expensive. And that was the point. If it cost a fortune and made your eyes water, it must be good. Ladies carried little bags of dried herbs, lavender, thyme, mint, and held them near their faces during gatherings. Not because they were fragrant. Because they were weapons. Aromatherapy, medieval style. One whiff of that, and you could survive a full minute near the bishop. These were called nosegays, which sounded sweet, but were really just biological countermeasures. A nosegay wasn't a gift. It was a shield. And if you received one, it wasn't because someone loved you. It was because they'd noticed you'd been near the stables. And then there were the gloves. Long, elegant, made of soft leather. Knights wore them to hold lances. Ladies wore them to hide their hands. But they also served another purpose. They were soaked in herbs. Rosemary. Sage. Sometimes even crushed cloves. So when a suitor took a lady's hand, he wasn't just touching her. He was breathing in a cloud of botanical distraction. It didn't make her smell better. It just made everything smell like a spice market after a storm. Which, honestly, was an improvement. Kissing? Don't be naive. Kissing was rare. And when it happened, it was on the cheek. Briefly. Like a bird landing on a fence. And only after careful assessment of the air. A proper courtship could last years, not because of obstacles or family feuds, but because neither party could get close enough without wanting to escape. Love letters were safer. At least you could read them outside. Marriage wasn't much better. The wedding night was a gamble. You might have spent months writing poems to your bride, praising her golden hair and dove-like grace. But the first time you shared a bed? That was when reality arrived. In the dark, with the door shut, there was no escaping it. The warmth. The breath. The quiet, persistent smell of someone who had been wearing the same undertunic for a week. Some marriages lasted. Some ended before dawn. Not because of incompatibility. Because of olfactory betrayal. And yet, they believed in love. Truly. They just believed in it from a distance. like admiring a painting through a window. You could feel moved. You could be inspired. But you didn't have to touch it. That was the secret of medieval romance. It worked best when no one got too close. Emotion thrived in the open air. Affection bloomed in the breeze. And if you had to whisper sweet nothings, you did it from across the room, preferably with a light wind at your back. One poet wrote that his lady's breath was like the first wind of April over blooming hills. A beautiful line. Poignant. Romantic. And completely, utterly false. Her breath was probably sharp with onions and weak wine. Her teeth were not white. They were present. And her mouth hadn't been near water in days. But he didn't know that. He saw her from afar. He heard her voice. He imagined the rest. And that was enough. Imagination was the best deodorant of all. They didn't need closeness. They needed idea. The idea of beauty. The idea of purity. The idea of a woman who smelled of roses, even if the only rose nearby was dead and stuck to a wall. The truth didn't matter. The dream did. And as long as the lute played and the candles burned, and no one stood too close for too long, the illusion held. So the next time you complain about bad breath on a date, remember the knights and ladies of old. They didn't have mints. They didn't have toothbrushes. They didn't even have the concept of freshening up. They had poetry. And distance. And a lot of silent suffering. They loved not because it was easy, but because it was impossible, and they tried anyway, one polite bow at a time, one herb-filled glove, one carefully worded compliment about aura and presence and the wild, untamed woods. And as the moon rose over the castle, and the crickets sang, and the wind carried away the worst of it, two people sat apart, smiling, pretending they couldn't smell anything at all. Which, in its own quiet way, was the most romantic thing of all. Let's talk about the beating heart of medieval life, the marketplace. Not the quiet village square with a few cabbages and a nervous chicken. No, we're talking about the big one. The crowded, roaring, stinking beast of a place where cities came to buy, sell, argue, and breathe air so thick it felt like chewing. And the smell? Imagine a compost heap that's been invited to a party, stayed too long, and started flirting with the cheese. That was the market. That was civilization. Here's the wildest truth. In Paris, the main market once closed for a full week, not because of plague, not because of war, not because the king had a headache, but because the smell knocked out 3 merchants. One fainted while weighing sausages. Another collapsed after a customer leaned in to haggle. The third just sat down on a sack of barley and said, "I can't do this anymore," before being carried away by 2 boys who immediately asked for a raise. It wasn't recorded in the royal chronicles, but it was remembered. In whispers. In dreams. In the way people still avoid that corner of the city. The market wasn't just a place to shop. It was an assault. On the eyes, yes. On the ears, absolutely. But mostly on the nose. It didn't sneak up on you. It charged. One moment you're walking down a quiet street, thinking about your day. The next, wham, a wall of odor hits you like a wet blanket soaked in regret. You don't smell it slowly. You're engulfed. And there's no going back. Your nose has been taken hostage. Every stall had its own signature scent. The fishmonger? That was the one with the eyes. Not the fish's. They stared at you, glassy and judging, while their bodies turned slowly into something that no longer resembled food. The smell wasn't just fishy. It was personal. Like the sea had sent a message, you thought you could eat me? Look what I've become. People bought it anyway. Not because it was fresh. Because it was cheap. And because if you cooked it long enough, the neighbors would stop complaining, at least until the next batch arrived. Then there was the meat. Not in a fridge. Not in a shade. Just hanging there. In the sun. On a hook. Next to a dog that was also looking at it like it might be dinner. The butcher didn't wear gloves. He wore pride. And an apron that had been through wars. Flies weren't pests. They were staff. They buzzed around like they owned the place, which, in a way, they did. The meat wasn't labeled by cut. It was labeled by how long it's been there. Regulars could tell just by sniffing. Ah, this one's from Tuesday, they'd say, as if that were a good thing. The cheese stall was worse. Not because of the cheese itself, though some of it moved on its own, but because of the bouquet. One type looked like a rock, smelled like a wet cellar, and was said to have survived the last siege. Another bubbled slightly when you tapped it. The vendor claimed it was maturing. Customers claimed it was alive. No one argued. They just bought a small piece, paid extra for a cloth to wrap it in, and took it home to keep in a box they never opened again. And the vegetables, don't get started. They weren't displayed on clean beds of ice. They were dumped in carts, half rotten, covered in mud, occasionally still attached to something that looked like a root but might have been a creature. Cabbages were brown at the edges. Onions had sprouted green hair. Carrots were soft. But they were sold with enthusiasm. Fresh from the field. The seller would cry, which meant dug up yesterday and rolled through a pig pen on the way here. People bought them anyway. Not because they trusted the man. Because they were hungry. And because, compared to the fish, they smelled like hope. The real problem wasn't the food. It was the system. Nothing was thrown away. Not ever. If meat went off, it was boiled until it stopped arguing. If bread grew fur, it was called seasoned and sold to pilgrims. If a chicken stopped moving, it was resting and put back on display. Waste went into the street. Not in bins. Not in carts. Just tipped. So the ground wasn't dirt. It was a kind of soup. A slurry of mud, urine, old cabbage water, and things you didn't want to identify. Walking through the market wasn't walking. It was wading. And every step released a new wave of aroma, like opening a book that hadn't been touched in 100 years, but the book was made of meat. Animals didn't help. Goats wandered freely. Chickens pecked at scraps. Pigs, yes, pigs, were allowed in some markets because they cleaned up. Which they did. By eating the rot, rolling in the slop, and then being sold as meat. It was a full circle. A dirty, stinking, slightly squealing circle. One man reportedly tried to sell a pig he'd just seen eat a dead rat. "It's lean," he said, "and full of protein." He was arrested, not for the rat, but for false advertising. The pig was clearly not lean. Traders held cloths to their faces. Not masks. Just rags. Some soaked in vinegar. Others in wine. A few used herbs, crushed in their palms and rubbed under the nose like war paint. It didn't work. But it made them feel prepared. Like soldiers going into battle. And in a way, they were. The market wasn't commerce. It was survival. You went in with a list. You came out with something that might be what you wanted, and a smell that stayed in your clothes for days. Children ran through the chaos, laughing, chasing chickens, stepping in things they didn't notice. They didn't mind the smell. They didn't know any different. To them, this was normal. This was life. They'd grown up breathing air that could peel paint. Their noses had given up. Their parents said it was character building. Really, it was just building a thick, invisible layer of stench that followed them everywhere, like a loyal, terrible pet. And yet, the market never closed. Not for long. Because hunger is stronger than pride. And cheaper than perfume. People came back. Every day. They held their breath. They looked up. They pretended not to notice the fly in their soup. And they smiled. Not because they were happy. Because if you frowned, you might breathe in too deeply. The market was chaos. It was filth. It was alive. It smelled like the end of the world and the beginning of dinner. And somehow, it worked. Not because it was clean. Not because it was safe. But because it was there. A place where life, in all its messy, stinking glory, refused to be polite. And as the sun set and the stalls were cleared, or mostly cleared, the wind would sometimes shift. Just for a moment. And you'd catch a whiff of something clean. A flower in a window. A loaf of fresh bread. The river, far away. And for a second, you could almost forget. Almost believe that the world wasn't built on rot and denial. That people weren't just holding their breath and pretending. But then a goat would belch. Or a cart would spill. Or the fishmonger would open his secret box of extra ripe eels. And the truth would return. Heavy. Wet. Inescapable. The market wasn't just a place to buy food. It was a reminder. That civilization is thin. That order is temporary. And that no matter how many poems you write about roses, sometimes you just have to live in the stink and haggle your way through it. Here's a scandal the history books tried to wash away. Public bathhouses were shut down not because they were dirty, they weren't, but because people were having too much fun in them. And when people have fun without clothes, someone in power gets nervous. Especially in the 1200s, when joy was suspicious, skin was dangerous, and a good time could be mistaken for a sin. So they closed the baths. Not with fire. Not with plague. But with morality. And a very shaky excuse about vapors. Imagine a bathhouse in Paris or London, back when such things still existed. Warm rooms. Steam rising. Pools of clean water, heated by fires below. People soaking, chatting, laughing, scrubbing years of city life off their skin. Men, women, sometimes together, sometimes not, but always clean. Not spotless, perhaps, but clean enough to smell like herbs and sweat, not like a forgotten cellar. This wasn't luxury. It was normal. For centuries, people had washed like this. Romans built empires on it. Monks recommended it. Even kings went in, wrapped in towels like nervous penguins. And then, one day, someone in a robe with too many buttons decided it was all a trap. Too much pleasure, they said. Too much touching. Not that anyone was proving it. But the idea was enough. If people are relaxed, warm, and wet, they might start thinking for themselves. Or worse, enjoying it. So the bathhouses were condemned. Not because they spread disease. They didn't. They prevented it. But because they spread something far more dangerous, happiness. And in a world where suffering was next to godliness, happiness was practically heresy. The real irony? The same people who shut down the baths later blamed them for everything. The baths made people weak. They said. They opened the pores to evil air. They caused the plague. Never mind that the plague arrived after the baths were closed. Never mind that the streets, now full of unwashed bodies, became perfect breeding grounds for rats with travel plans. No. The baths were guilty. Because guilt needs a face. And a bathhouse, with its cheerful steam and lack of shame, was an easy target. Before the ban, bathhouses were social hubs. Like pubs, but with less ale and more scrubbing. You went to gossip. To meet friends. To escape the cold. Some even offered massages, with oils made from olives and thyme. Others had different rooms, hot, warm, cool. You could spend hours there, drifting in and out of sleep, listening to the quiet splash of water, the murmur of voices, the occasional snore from a man who'd had too much wine and too little shame. It was civilization at its simplest: warm water, clean skin, no pretense. But the authorities didn't see peace. They saw temptation. A woman with wet hair and a loose towel. That was a moral crisis. A man laughing in a pool? That was a threat to order. They didn't care that most people just wanted to be clean. They cared that they looked like they were enjoying it. And so, one by one, the bathhouses were sealed. Boards went up. Fires were doused. The water cooled. And Europe began its long, slow descent into the great stink. Some priests claimed that bathing was vanity. That to care about the body was to neglect the soul. Let the filth remain, they said, as a reminder of our sin. Which was a noble idea if you didn't have to sit next to them at dinner. Others said water carried disease through the skin, a theory so wild it should have come with a circus. But it spread faster than the truth. Soon, people were afraid to wash. Not because they were dirty. Because they were obedient. And obedience, in those days, smelled like old wool and regret. The few who still bathed did so in secret. A quick scrub behind a curtain. A dip in a river at dawn. A sponge with warm water, used quickly, quietly, like a forbidden prayer. And even then, they felt guilty. Not because it was wrong, but because it felt too good. Pleasure had become the enemy. Clean skin was suspicious. If you smelled fresh, people looked at you sideways. "What are you hiding?" their eyes said. "Why do you care so much?" In a world that worshipped suffering, cleanliness was practically a confession. And yet, the memory of the baths lingered. Old men would whisper about the steam rooms, the warmth, the way your muscles forgot their pain. They had water that bubbled like soup, one said. And a man would rub your back with a stone that wasn't sharp, but knew your bones. It sounded like heaven. Or madness. Or both. The young didn't believe them. How could such a place exist? In a world where the king hadn't washed in years, where the church feared soap, where the air in cities could knock a bird from the sky, who would allow cleanliness? But it had been real. And its loss wasn't just about dirt. It was about comfort. About dignity. About the simple idea that a human being might deserve to feel light, just once in a while. Not blessed. Not saved. Just clean. But that was too simple. Too human. And in a time when power came from control, the bathhouse was a threat. Because you can't rule someone who feels good in their skin. So they closed them. Not with war. Not with fire. But with words. With fear. With the quiet, steady voice of someone who'd rather see you suffer than smile. And Europe, slowly, forgot how to wash. Not because it couldn't, but because it was told it shouldn't. And when you stop washing, not out of laziness, but out of belief, that's when the real filth begins, not on the skin, but in the mind. Years later, when the plague came, they blamed the air. The stars. The Jews. The cats. But never the real enemy, the silence where the baths used to be. The empty rooms. The cold pipes. The absence of steam rising into the night. Because a clean people might have survived. But a scared, stinking, obedient people, they were easy to lose. And as the wind blew through the boarded up doors, and the dust settled on the dry tiles, the bathhouses stood like tombs. Not for the dead, but for an idea. That joy, warmth, and clean skin were not sins. That sometimes, the most rebellious thing a person can do is simply take a bath. And somewhere, deep in the memory of Europe, the steam still rises. Quiet. Warm. Impossible to hold. But impossible to forget. Here's a secret the portraits never show. The most important skill among nobles wasn't swordplay, horsemanship, or knowing which fork to use when forks hadn't been invented yet. It was breathing through the mouth while looking like you'd never heard of lungs. A nobleman's true talent wasn't in ruling. It was in endurance, specifically, the ability to stand in a room full of stewed cabbage, old wine, and the quiet decay of human underarms, and still appear divine. It was an art. A silent, wheezing art. And it was taught from childhood. Imagine a young lord, no older than 10, being trained in the royal chambers. Not in reading. Not in prayer. But in presence. Head high, the tutor would say. Back straight. Smile slightly. And for God's sake, don't sniff. Because sniffing was weakness. Sniffing meant you noticed. And noticing the air was a peasant habit. A noble didn't smell the world. He imposed on it. So the boy learned to breathe shallowly through his mouth, like a fish that had been dragged onto land but refused to admit it. If he gagged, he was punished. Not for being sick. For being rude. The real test came at banquets. Great halls packed with lords, ladies, servants, dogs, and whatever was left of last week's boar. The air wasn't just thick. It was layered. At floor level, damp rushes, trampled by boots, soaked in ale, home to beetles and forgotten bones. Mid-air, the warm cloud of bodies, wool, and sweat that had been building since morning. And above, near the rafters, the lingering ghost of smoke, incense, and something that might have been perfume, or might have been a small animal on fire. To walk into that hall was to enter a living stew. To dine in it was to commit to the lie. And the lie was this: everything is fine. The king sits at the head, crowned, velvet draped, smiling. He does not wrinkle his nose. He does not fan himself. He does not, under any circumstances, suggest opening a window. That would be admitting defeat. Instead, he takes slow, shallow breaths, like a man sleeping with a cat on his chest. His eyes stay calm. His voice stays steady. He raises a goblet. He laughs at a joke. And all the while, his body is screaming air. Clean air. Anything. But his face? His face is a masterpiece of denial. Ladies were even better at it. They had more practice. A noble woman could stand next to a man whose breath could peel varnish, smile, compliment his hat, and mentally compose a poem about distant meadows, all without inhaling deeply enough to trigger a cough. Their secret? The pomander. That little metal ball on a chain, dangling from the wrist, filled with dried herbs, spices, and sometimes a drop of something vaguely citrus. It wasn't jewelry. It was a life support system. She'd lift it to her nose, not too obviously, like she was checking the time, and take a quick, discreet whiff of cloves and regret. Then back to the conversation. "How is your mother?" she'd ask, while her soul fled the room. Some nobles developed techniques. One duke was said to breathe only during thunderclaps, when the noise covered any snuffling. Another blinked 3 times before inhaling, a signal to his body to brace. A countess in Burgundy trained her dog to sit near her during feasts, not for comfort, but because the animal's fur absorbed the worst of the smell, acting as a furry filter. When the dog died, she mourned less the pet and more the fresh air it had once provided. And then there were the clothes. Layers upon layers. Velvet, wool, fur, linen, all trapping heat, sweat, and scent like a blanket over a fire. A noble didn't just wear a tunic. He wore history. The same garment, worn for weeks, absorbing meals, emotions, and the occasional spill. Washing it? Out of the question. It would lose its character, its authority. Instead, they'd air it, hang it outside for an hour, slap it a few times, and call it clean. The smell wasn't dirt. It was tradition. And tradition, like mildew, was meant to linger. The worst was winter. No open windows. No breeze. Just fire, bodies, and the slow build-up of breath that had been recycled too many times. One monk recorded a feast where 3 guests fainted not from wine, but from the air itself. They were carried out, revived with vinegar, and brought back in, because leaving early was worse than breathing poison. Etiquette was stronger than lungs. And yet, they called this civilization. This was refinement. This was culture. To sit through a meal where the main dish and the host competed for who reeked more, and to do it with grace, that was nobility. That was power. A peasant might wash, but he couldn't endure. A knight might fight, but he couldn't suffer silently. Only the aristocracy could sit still, smile, and slowly suffocate in the name of dignity. They didn't complain. They didn't even whisper. To admit the air was bad was to admit you were common. That you hadn't risen above the body. That you still needed comfort. And a true noble didn't need comfort. He needed respect. Even if it killed him. Slowly. Quietly. With excellent posture. Children were trained early. Don't wrinkle your nose, mothers would say. It's unbecoming. If you must breathe, do it through your mouth, and never, ever sigh. They learned to associate fresh air with chaos. A breeze meant disorder. An open window meant anarchy. The perfect room was sealed, warm, and thick with the scent of people who had been there too long. That was home. That was safety. And when they traveled, that was the real test. Carriages with no windows. Tents that smelled of damp leather and old men. Inns where the mattress was alive. Yet still, the nobleman stepped out, straightened his coat, and declared, "Charming." Not because it was, but because saying otherwise would mean admitting he felt something. And feeling was for poets. For beggars. For people who hadn't spent years learning how not to. So the next time you take a deep breath and think nothing of it, remember the lords and ladies of old. They didn't have that luxury. They had duty. The duty to stand in a world that stank and pretend it was perfume. To smile at a man whose breath could wilt flowers and say, "You're looking well." To survive not by strength, not by wisdom, but by the quiet, heroic act of not breathing too deeply. And as the candles burned low and the hall emptied, and the last noble finally slipped behind a curtain to gasp like a fish on land, the truth returned. Not in words. Not in laws. But in a single, shuddering breath of air that tasted, at last, like something close to free. Here's the cruelest joke history ever played. When the Black Death arrived, people blamed the air. Not the rats. Not the fleas. Not the fact that everyone had been living in a pile of their own leftovers for centuries. No, they blamed bad air. Miasma, they called it. A poisonous fog of rotten sin that floated through the streets, looking for weak lungs. And so, they did what any sensible medieval person would do, they made the air even worse. They burned herbs. They waved cloths soaked in vinegar. They shut the windows tighter than ever, as if God had sent a plague and the best defense was suffocation. Doctors wore masks shaped like bird beaks, stuffed with lavender, mint, and things they hoped would help. They looked like nightmares with PhDs. And they walked through villages, swinging censers, muttering prayers, and spreading more smoke, and not to cure the sick, but to drown out the smell of death. Which, ironically, only made the air more poisonous. But at least it smelled expensive. The truth? The air wasn't the killer. It was just the messenger. The real problem wasn't what they breathed in. It was what they were. A continent of people who hadn't washed properly in generations. Who lived in houses where the floor was a mix of mud, waste, and last Tuesday's soup. Who shared beds, clothes, and breath like it was normal. And it was normal. That was the tragedy. The filth wasn't an accident. It was routine. A way of life built on fear, faith, and the quiet belief that suffering was holy. And then, the plague came. And for the first time in centuries, something was worse than the smell. It moved fast. Silent. Relentless. One day, a man was arguing over a chicken. The next, he was a sack of fever and blackened skin. Bodies piled up. Not in graves. In streets. In doorways. In the corners of churches where the incense had finally given up. And the smell? It wasn't just decay. It was change. A new stench, deeper than the old ones. The smell of a world that had stopped pretending. But here's the strange thing, as the death toll rose, the air began to improve. Not because people were cleaner. Because there were fewer of them. Fewer bodies. Fewer feasts. Fewer lords holding their breath at banquets. The streets were quieter. The markets half empty. The castles cold. And in that silence, something rare happened. The wind could finally move. No more crowds. No more stewed cabbage. No more chamber pots tipping into moats like it was a royal tradition. Just wind. Real, open, clean wind. Blowing through empty halls, across abandoned fields, past houses with doors left open. For the first time in memory, you could walk outside and not feel like you were swallowing a blanket. You could breathe. Deeply. Without thinking. Without punishment. And no one celebrated. They were too afraid. Too broken. But somewhere, deep in the lungs of Europe, a reflex returned. The simple act of filling your chest with air that didn't taste like regret. Children who survived grew up knowing less fear, less ritual, less stench. They didn't know it then, but they were the first to live in a world where clean air wasn't a sin. The church blamed sin. The kings blamed foreigners. The doctors blamed the stars. But the rats, quiet and efficient, knew the truth. They hadn't brought the plague. They'd just moved in. The house was already ready. Warm. Crowded. Full of food and filth. A perfect home. And when the humans started dying, the rats didn't cheer. They just kept eating. And living. And being, frankly, more sensible than anyone else. After the worst had passed, people came back. Slowly. Cautiously. They rebuilt. They replanted. They even, in some places, started washing again. Not because they suddenly loved water, but because the old rules had broken. The idea that dirt was holy? That had died with the rest. If God had wanted them to suffer, why save some and not others? Maybe, just maybe, he preferred clean sheets. Bathhouses didn't return overnight, but the fear of them faded. The idea that joy was dangerous, less convincing when half your family was gone. And so, quietly, the world began to change. Not with a revolution, not with a sermon, but with a breath. A deep one. The kind that fills your chest and doesn't burn. They didn't realize it then, but the plague had done something no king, no pope, no poet ever could. It made space. Space for air. For silence. For the simple truth that a person shouldn't have to hold their breath just to be polite. And as the years passed, the stories of the great stink began to fade. Not because they weren't true, but because they became unbelievable. Parents would tell their children about a time when no one washed, when windows stayed shut, when the smell of a castle was its best defense. And the children would laugh. That's not real, they'd say. No one could live like that. And the parents would smile. Not to argue, but because they knew some truths are too strange to survive memory. So the Middle Ages ended not with a bang, not with a discovery, but with a sneeze. A final, wet, desperate sneeze, and then, at last, a long, slow breath of air that didn't kill you. And somewhere, in a field far from any castle, a single flower grew. No one saw it. No one praised it. But it was there. Small. Quiet. Alive. And for the first time in a long time, the wind carried its scent, not far, not loud, but clear. Not of power. Not of prayer. Not of rot. Just of something green. Something new. And something, at last, almost sweet. During the time that came to be known as the late period of ancient Egypt, which began around the year 700 before the Common Era, the way in which pharaohs chose their spouses began to shift in small and gradual ways. These changes were not sudden or dramatic, but rather they unfolded slowly over many years, almost without notice. The marriages of the rulers were not usually based on personal feelings or emotional connections, but instead were shaped by the needs of the state and the desire to maintain stability in a time of uncertainty. It was common for a pharaoh to marry a woman from another region or kingdom, not because he wished to, but because it was believed that such a union might help to prevent conflict or strengthen an alliance. These marriages were arranged by advisors, priests, and officials who spent long hours discussing the possible benefits and risks of each potential match. The process was often slow and filled with formalities, with many meetings held in quiet rooms where little was said that had not been said before. The women who became queens through these marriages often came from places outside of Egypt, such as Assyria, Babylon, or regions in what is now Libya. Their arrival in Egypt was marked by ceremonies that lasted for days, though these events were not always joyful or filled with celebration. Instead, they followed a strict order of steps that had been used for generations. There would be a procession through the city, with the new queen riding in a covered litter carried by servants. The streets would be cleaned the night before, and offerings would be placed at temples along the route. Priests would chant in low voices, repeating the same phrases over and over, while the people stood quietly and watched. There was little music, and even less dancing. The mood was serious, as if everyone understood that this was not a moment of personal happiness, but a necessary act of state. Once the marriage had taken place, the queen would take on certain duties at the royal court. She would appear at official events, sit beside the pharaoh during ceremonies, and participate in religious rituals. Her role was not to make decisions or influence policy, but to be present, to be seen, and to fulfill the expectations that had been set long before her arrival. She would wear the traditional headdress and robes, which were heavy and uncomfortable, and she would speak only when spoken to. Her daily life was highly structured, with little variation from one day to the next. She would rise at the same time each morning, eat the same meals, and follow the same path through the palace corridors. There were no surprises in her routine, and that was considered a good thing. The pharaoh himself did not spend much time with his foreign wife. His days were filled with meetings, inspections of construction projects, and religious obligations. He would see her during formal meals or at temple festivals, but their interactions were brief and polite. There was no expectation of affection between them, and no one spoke of love in connection with their union. Instead, the focus remained on the children they might produce, for it was through offspring that the line of rulers could continue. If a child was born, especially a son, it was seen as a sign that the marriage had served its purpose. If no child came, the situation was accepted without complaint, and the pharaoh might take another wife or simply continue without one. Over time, these marriages became a regular part of political life in Egypt. Each new ruler followed the same pattern, choosing a spouse based on where she came from and what her family could offer, rather than who she was as a person. The names of the queens were recorded in official documents, but little else was written about them. They did not lead armies, give speeches, or make laws. Their presence was a formality, a symbol of unity between two lands, but not a source of power or change. The records that mention them are brief and dry, listing only their names, their origins, and the dates of their marriages. There are no stories of their thoughts or feelings, no accounts of private conversations or moments of joy. They exist in the historical record as quiet figures, moving through the background of a much larger and slower process. As the years passed, the practice of marrying foreign women continued, but it did not bring lasting peace or security. Alliances formed through marriage often broke down after a few years, sometimes even before the queen had adjusted to life in Egypt. War still happened, borders still shifted, and the power of the pharaohs remained uncertain. The marriages did not stop invasions or prevent internal conflicts. They were simply one of many tools used by rulers who were trying to hold on to authority in a changing world. And yet, the tradition persisted, not because it worked, but because it had always been done that way. There was comfort in repetition, in knowing that each new pharaoh would follow the same steps, say the same words, and make the same choices as those who came before. The temples where these marriages were sometimes blessed stood for centuries, their walls covered in carvings that showed kings and queens standing side by side, hands resting gently on ceremonial objects. The images were always the same, the pharaoh slightly taller, the queen slightly behind, both looking forward with calm expressions. No one smiled in these carvings, and no one appeared to be in motion. They were frozen in time, part of a scene that was meant to last forever, even though the people it represented had long since disappeared. The stone did not show the long silences, the cold rooms, or the weight of expectation that filled the lives of those who lived through these unions. It only showed the surface, the part that was meant to be seen. In the end, the marriages of the late-period pharaohs were not about passion or even about partnership. They were about continuity, about maintaining a system that had existed for hundreds of years. They were quiet, predictable, and uneventful, exactly what was needed in a time when too much change could lead to collapse. And so, year after year, decade after decade, the same process repeated itself, with little variation and even less excitement. The sun rose and set, the Nile flooded and receded, and the pharaohs took their brides from distant lands, not because they wanted to, but because it was the way things had always been done. The practice of marrying within the royal family was not new during the years between 700 and 200 before the Common Era, but it became more common and more accepted as time passed. It was not a sudden change, nor was it something that people discussed in great detail. Instead, it was simply a part of how things were done, like the way offerings were made at temples or how officials recorded the harvest each year. When a pharaoh chose a wife from among his own relatives, it was not seen as unusual or strange. It was seen as normal, as expected, as the way to keep the royal bloodline pure and undisturbed by outside influence. The idea was that power and authority should remain within the family, not be shared with people from other regions or other lineages. This belief was quiet but strong, like a current beneath the surface of a slowly moving river. Most often, these internal marriages involved a brother and a sister, or sometimes a man and his half-sister. The children born from such unions were considered to be of the highest status, because both parents carried the royal title and the sacred connection to the gods. There was no concern about the health of the children or the long-term effects of such unions. These ideas did not exist in the way they do today. Instead, people believed that the royal family was different from ordinary people, that they were protected by divine favor, and that their blood was not subject to the same rules as others. The gods had married among themselves in the old stories, and so it made sense that the pharaoh, who was seen as a living god, should follow the same pattern. The marriages themselves were quiet events. There was no large celebration, no public festival, no procession through the city. The ceremony took place in a small room within the palace, often in the early morning when the light was soft and the air was cool. A priest would be present, dressed in plain linen, and he would speak in a low voice, reciting words that had been used for generations. The bride would wear a simple white robe, and the groom would wear the same ceremonial collar he wore every day. There were no rings, no exchange gifts, no vows that required emotion or personal promise. The act was formal, brief, and final. Once it was done, the couple would return to their usual routines, as if nothing had changed. Life after the marriage followed a predictable path. The wife would move into a room near the pharaoh's chambers, but they did not spend much time together. Their interactions were limited to official appearances, religious duties, and occasional meals held in the presence of court officials. There was little conversation between them, and even less affection. The purpose of the marriage was not companionship, but continuity. The hope was always that a child would be born, preferably a son, who could one day take the throne. Until that happened, the queen would continue her duties, which included making offerings at temples, overseeing the royal household, and appearing in carvings and inscriptions that showed her standing behind the pharaoh. The children who were born from these marriages were raised in a highly controlled environment. They did not play with other children, nor did they leave the palace grounds except for rare ceremonial occasions. Their days were filled with lessons in reading, writing, and religious practice, all taught by elderly tutors who spoke slowly and repeated the same information many times. There was no music, no games, no laughter in their education. Discipline was calm but constant, and any sign of disobedience was met with silence, not punishment. The goal was not to make them happy, but to make them ready. They were being prepared for a life of duty, not freedom. As the years passed, the pattern repeated itself with little variation. Each new pharaoh, when he came to power, would often marry a sister or a close female relative. The reasons for this were never explained in detail, but they were understood by everyone involved. It was tradition. It was stability. It was the way to avoid conflict with other noble families who might otherwise claim a share of power through marriage. By keeping the royal line closed, the rulers believed they were protecting the throne from outside influence and internal division. There was no debate about whether this was right or wrong. There was only the quiet acceptance that this was how things had always been done. The temples and monuments built during this time often showed images of the royal family standing together in neat rows, each figure slightly smaller than the one before, as if to show their place in the order of things. The pharaoh stood at the front, the queen slightly behind, and the children arranged in a line to the side. Their faces were calm, their hands held in the same position, their clothing identical in style. These images were carved into stone with great care, but they did not capture any sense of individuality. No one smiled. No one looked to the side. They all faced forward, as if looking into a distant future they would never see. There were no records of private conversations between the members of these families. No letters, no diaries, no personal reflections have survived, if they ever existed. The official documents only mention births, deaths, marriages, and temple offerings. They do not speak of love, or conflict, or longing. They do not describe the long afternoons spent in silent rooms, or the weight of expectation that rested on each new generation. The people who lived these lives are known only by their titles and their relationships: daughter of the king, wife of the ruler, mother of the heir. Their names are listed in inscriptions, but their voices are gone. Even when illness came, or when a child died young, there was little written about it. These events were recorded in passing, with the same tone as a note about the level of the Nile or the number of oxen in the royal herd. There was no mourning in the texts, no expression of grief. The loss was absorbed into the routine, like a small stone dropped into still water. The family continued, the rituals continued, the days passed one after another without disruption. The idea of personal emotion was not absent, but it was not something that belonged in the official record. Over time, the practice of internal marriage became so common that it was no longer questioned. It was simply part of the structure of royal life, like the walls of the palace or the path to the temple. It did not bring happiness, nor was it meant to. It was meant to preserve order, to maintain the appearance of divine continuity, and to prevent change. And in that, it was successful, at least for a time. The throne passed from one generation to the next, each ruler connected to the last by blood and ritual, each marriage a quiet repetition of the one before. By the time the centuries began to turn toward the year 200 before the Common Era, the tradition was still in place, though the world around it was changing. New powers were rising, new ideas were spreading, and the old ways were beginning to feel heavier, harder to carry. But still, the marriages continued. Still, the same steps were followed. Still, the same words were spoken in the same quiet rooms. There was no rush to end the practice, no sudden realization that it might not be necessary. It simply went on, as quietly and steadily as the flow of sand in an hourglass, marking time without making a sound. The women who lived in the royal courts during the centuries between 700 and 200 before the Common Era did not speak often in public, nor were their words recorded in the same way as those of men. Their presence was noted, their names sometimes written in stone or on papyrus, but their thoughts were not preserved. They moved through the halls of the palace in quiet steps, wearing long robes that brushed the floor, their hair covered or braided in the same style for years at a time. They did not lead armies, issue decrees, or attend the meetings where decisions about grain, taxes, or borders were made. Their role was not one of action, but of position. They were part of the structure of the court, like columns in a temple or rows of trees along a canal, steady and expected. When a woman became a queen through marriage to a pharaoh, her life changed in form, but not always in substance. She was given new titles, new rooms, and new duties, but the rhythm of her days remained much the same. She rose at dawn, performed her ablutions in silence, and dressed in garments that had been prepared the night before. Her meals were brought to her at fixed times, always the same food served on the same plates. She walked the same paths through the palace each day, passing the same statues, the same painted walls, the same guards who stood without speaking. There was little variation in her schedule, and that was considered a sign of order, not boredom. Her main responsibilities involved religious offerings and appearances at ceremonies. She would stand beside the pharaoh during rituals at the temple, holding a small jar of oil or a bouquet of flowers, neither of which she would use. Her presence was symbolic, meant to show that the royal family was complete, that the divine order was being followed. She did not speak during these events, nor did she perform any actions beyond what had been practiced in advance. A priest would guide her steps if she needed to move, but usually she only stood still, looking forward, her hands resting at her sides. The people who watched from a distance saw her as part of the scene, not as a person with a separate will. Some queens were the mothers of future pharaohs, and in those cases, their status was slightly higher. They were referred to with honorifics, their names appeared more frequently in inscriptions, and they were sometimes allowed to oversee parts of the palace household. But even then, their authority was indirect. They did not give orders themselves, but rather approved requests that had already been reviewed by officials. They did not make laws or change traditions. Their influence, if it existed, was quiet and slow, felt more than seen, like a change in the temperature before a storm. It was never spoken of openly, and no records explain how or when a queen might have affected a decision. The marriages that brought these women into the royal family were not based on personal choice. A woman did not select her husband, nor was she asked for her opinion on the matter. The arrangement was made by elders, priests, and senior advisors who considered her lineage, her health, and her family's loyalty to the throne. Once the decision was made, it was final. There was no discussion, no delay, no opportunity to refuse. The marriage would take place on a date chosen by astrologers, at a time when the stars were in a favorable position, though the meaning of those positions was never explained to the woman involved. After the marriage, she would be taught the routines of court life by older women who had held the same role. These instructors spoke in low voices and repeated the same instructions many times. They taught her how to walk, how to stand, how to hold her hands, how to bow, how to remain silent during long ceremonies. She learned which rooms she could enter and which were forbidden, which topics were not to be discussed, and how to respond if someone addressed her directly. Most of her training involved doing nothing, standing still, waiting, listening without reacting. These were the skills that mattered most. There were no celebrations for her arrival, no songs sung in her honor, no public recognition of her individuality. She was not introduced as a person, but as a role, wife of the king, daughter of such and such a noble, bearer of the royal line. Her name was used in official records, but only in connection with the men in her life. She was the sister of a ruler, the mother of a prince, the daughter of a general. Her own identity was not the focus. Over time, she would begin to think of herself in the same way, not as someone with desires or dreams, but as a part of a system that had existed long before her and would continue long after. The children she bore were raised by nurses and tutors, not by her. She might see them each day for a short time, usually in the morning, when they would stand before her and recite a verse or show a drawing they had made. She would nod, say a few quiet words, and then they would be taken away. There was no playing on the floor, no holding, no laughing together. These things were not forbidden, but they were not part of the routine. The children belonged to the state, not to her, and their upbringing was designed to prepare them for duty, not for affection. Some queens lived for many years without ever leaving the palace grounds. Their world was bounded by stone walls and guarded gates. They saw the same faces every day, servants, priests, officials, none of whom spoke to them unless spoken to. They had no friends, no confidants, no companions of equal status. Other women in the court were either servants or distant relatives, none of whom could share their position. Loneliness was not named, but it was present, like dust on a shelf, unnoticed but always there. When a pharaoh died, his wife did not remarry immediately, if at all. She might take on the title of Queen Mother if her son became ruler, or she might retire to a quieter part of the palace, where her duties were reduced to occasional appearances and silent prayers. Her influence, if any, would be at its highest during the early years of a new reign, when traditions were being re-established and advisors were being chosen. But even then, her role was behind the scenes, expressed through small gestures, a look, a pause in conversation. She did not sign documents or attend council meetings. Her presence was felt in the way decisions were framed, not in the decisions themselves. The inscriptions that mention these women are brief and formal. They list their names, their titles, and the names of the rulers they were connected to. They do not describe their appearance, their personality, or their thoughts. There are no stories of private moments, no records of what they said in private rooms. The carvings on temple walls show them standing behind the pharaoh, slightly smaller, slightly to the side, their hands folded in front of them. They are always dressed the same way, always in the same pose, as if they were part of the background rather than the main event. Over the centuries, generation after generation of royal women lived this way. Their lives were long, quiet, and uneventful. They did not seek change, nor were they expected to. They were part of a system that valued stability above all else. Their marriages were not about love or partnership, but about continuity. Their children were not raised for happiness, but for duty. Their presence at ceremonies was not to honor them, but to complete the image of order that the state wished to project. By the time the years approached 200 before the Common Era, the role of royal women had not changed in any noticeable way. The same routines were followed, the same silences observed, the same paths walked. The world outside was shifting, new rulers came from distant lands, new languages were spoken in the streets, new gods were being honored, but within the palace, little was different. The women still stood in the same places, wore the same clothes, and played the same quiet roles. They were not forgotten, exactly, but they were not remembered either. They existed in the space between events, in the silence between words, in the long, slow passage of time that marked the end of an era. When the rulers from the north began to take control of Egypt, the changes that followed were not sudden or dramatic. They came slowly, like the gradual shift in temperature at the start of a new season. The men who came from the land of the Greeks did not destroy the old temples or erase the names of the gods. They did not ban the priests or stop the rituals that had been performed for centuries. Instead, they allowed these things to continue, while quietly placing themselves at the center of power. They spoke a different language, wore different clothes, and followed different customs in private, but in public, they behaved as pharaohs always had. They stood in the same poses in carvings, made offerings at the same altars, and claimed the same divine status as those who came before them. The people saw little reason to resist, because very little seemed to change. The arrival of the Greek rulers did not bring loud celebrations or open conflict. It was not marked by fire or music, but by paperwork, quiet meetings, and small adjustments to the way things were done. Officials continued to collect grain, record harvests, and manage the canals. Priests still performed their duties at sunrise. The sun still rose over the desert, the Nile still flooded in its time, and the stars still moved across the sky in the same patterns. Life for most people went on as it always had. The difference was in the names at the top of the lists, in the way orders were now written in 2 languages, and in the slow appearance of new faces in the palace. One of the first changes, though it was not noticed at first, was in the way marriages were arranged. The new rulers, who called themselves kings but were also called pharaohs, did not always marry women from distant lands or from Egyptian noble families. Instead, they often chose women from their own circle, from among those who had come with them from the north. These women spoke Greek, wore different styles of clothing, and followed customs that were unfamiliar to the people of Egypt. But they were given the title of queen, appeared in official ceremonies, and were shown in carvings standing beside the king, just as the old queens had been. The ceremonies for these marriages were longer than before and included words that few could understand. Priests from both traditions were present, one reciting in Egyptian, the other in Greek, their voices overlapping in a way that made the meaning unclear. There were more objects involved: crowns, scrolls, small statues, placed on tables covered with cloth of a deep purple color. The bride wore a veil that covered her face until a certain moment in the ritual, when it was lifted by a child chosen for the occasion. These details were new, but they were not rejected. They were absorbed into the existing order, like a small stone added to a wall that had stood for centuries. Over time, the presence of Greek customs became more common, but never overwhelming. The rulers did not force their ways on the people. They built temples in the old style, supported the priesthood, and followed the rituals connected to the flooding of the Nile. At the same time, they also built gymnasiums where young men could exercise, established schools where Greek was taught, and held quiet gatherings where philosophy was discussed in low voices. These activities took place in separate spaces, away from the temples and the markets, and most people did not attend them. They were for the ruling class, for those who served in the palace, for the soldiers and scribes who had come from distant lands. The queens of this period lived in a space between two worlds. They were expected to appear Egyptian in public, to wear the traditional headdresses, to stand beside the king in the correct position during ceremonies, and to make offerings to the old gods. But in private, they followed Greek customs, spoke their native language, and raised their children with different habits. Their rooms in the palace were furnished differently, with chairs instead of floor cushions, tables with writing materials, and mirrors made of polished metal. They read scrolls that told stories of distant heroes, listened to music played on stringed instruments, and sometimes wrote letters to family members who lived far away. The children born from these marriages were given names that combined both traditions. They had Greek first names and Egyptian titles. They were taught to speak both languages, though they often spoke Greek more easily. Their education was long and slow, filled with repetition and memorization. They learned about the gods of Egypt, the rituals of the temple, the history of the pharaohs, but they also studied Greek poetry, the movements of the stars, and the rules of debate. Their tutors were careful not to favor one tradition over the other, but to present both as equally important, even when they clearly were not. The king himself lived a divided life. In public, he was a pharaoh, dressed in linen robes, wearing the double crown, performing rituals with solemn silence. In private, he might wear a simple tunic, walk through gardens designed in the Greek style, and discuss matters of state in a language that most of his people did not understand. He attended both temple festivals and quiet dinners with foreign advisors. He made offerings to Amun and also honored Zeus in a smaller shrine within the palace grounds. These acts were not seen as contradictory, but as necessary. He was not just a ruler of Egypt, but a link between two worlds, and his marriage was part of that balance. The marriages of this time were not passionate or romantic. They were not celebrated with dancing or loud music. They were formal events held in the early afternoon, attended by officials, priests, and a small number of guests. There was no feast, no wine poured freely, no singing that lasted into the night. The couple would stand before a table with offerings, repeat words that had been written down for them, and then walk a short path to a room where they would be left alone for a short time. After that, they would return to their duties as if nothing had changed. The people who lived in the cities and villages did not speak much about these marriages. They had little information about them, and even less reason to care. The price of bread, the level of the river, the arrival of tax collectors, these were the things that affected their lives. The marriage of a king to a foreign woman was a matter for the palace, not for the streets. It was recorded in official documents, mentioned in temple inscriptions, but not discussed in homes or markets. It was simply another fact, like the name of the current ruler or the year in the cycle of the flood. As the years passed, the presence of Greek influence became more visible, but never dominant. The old ways continued in the temples and in the fields. The new ways existed in the palace, in the administrative offices, in the homes of those who served the king. The two systems ran alongside each other, like two canals that never quite meet. The marriages of the rulers reflected this separation. They were unions between individuals, but also between traditions, each side keeping its own customs, its own language, its own understanding of the world. There was no effort to blend the two completely. No attempt was made to create a single, unified culture. Instead, there was a quiet acceptance of difference, as long as order was maintained and the flow of grain and taxes continued uninterrupted. The king married a Greek woman, but she played the role of an Egyptian queen, The priests kept their power, but reported to officials who spoke a different language. The people went to the temples, celebrated the old festivals, and lived their lives as they always had. By the time the years approached 500 before the Common Era, the pattern was well established. The rulers were Greek in origin, but Egyptian in appearance. Their marriages followed a mixed form, neither fully one thing nor the other. The women who became queens did not change the system, nor were they expected to. They fulfilled their roles, stood in the right places, and bore children who would continue the line. The future was not discussed, the past was not questioned, and the present moved forward at a steady, unchanging pace. The rulers who came after the first of the Ptolemies followed a pattern that had been set long before any of them were born. It was not a rule written in stone, nor was it ever formally declared in a public decree. It was simply understood, passed down from one generation to the next through quiet example and unspoken agreement. A king would marry a woman from his own family, usually a sister or a close female relative, and this union would be accepted without question. The reason for this practice was not often discussed, but when it was mentioned, it was said to preserve the purity of the royal blood and to prevent power from passing into the hands of outsiders. There was no debate about whether this was right or natural. It was simply the way things were done, like the rising of the sun or the annual flood of the Nile. Each new ruler, when he reached the proper age, would be married to a woman who shared his name and his ancestry. The ceremony was always held in the palace, never in a public temple, and it followed the same order of events each time. A priest would stand before the couple, dressed in plain linen, and speak in a low, steady voice. The words he used were the same ones that had been spoken at previous ceremonies, repeated across decades with only slight variations in tone. The bride would wear a white robe with a golden border, and the groom would wear the ceremonial collar of office. They would stand side by side, facing forward, their hands resting at their sides. There would be no exchange of personal vows, no touching, no eye contact. The entire event lasted less than an hour and was attended by a small group of officials, priests, and distant relatives who remained silent throughout. After the marriage, the queen would take on the duties that had been assigned to queens before her. She would appear at religious festivals, stand beside the king during temple offerings, and be shown in carvings on the walls of new buildings. Her image would be smaller than the king's, placed slightly behind him, as was proper. She would make appearances at certain rituals, holding a lotus flower or a small jar of oil, though she never actually used these objects. Her presence was symbolic, meant to show that the royal line was intact and that tradition was being followed. She did not speak during these events, nor was she expected to. Her role was to be seen, not heard. The couple did not live together in the way that ordinary people might. They had separate rooms in the palace, different schedules, and little time spent in each other's company. Their interactions were limited to official functions and brief meetings with advisors. There was no record of private conversations between them, no letters, no personal reflections. The idea of affection or companionship was not part of the arrangement. The purpose of the marriage was not personal happiness, but continuity. The hope, always present but never spoken aloud, was that a child would be born, preferably a son, who could one day inherit the throne and continue the line. The children who were born from these unions were raised in a quiet, controlled environment. They did not play with other children or leave the inner rooms of the palace except for ceremonial occasions. Their days were filled with lessons in reading, writing, and religious practice, all taught by elderly tutors who spoke slowly and repeated the same information many times. They learned about the gods of Egypt, the rituals of the temple, and the history of the kings, but they also studied Greek language and the movement of the stars. Their education was long and without variation, designed to prepare them for duty, not for joy. As each new ruler came to power, the same pattern repeated itself. He would marry a sister or a close female relative, the ceremony would be held in the same room, the same words would be spoken, the same robes worn. There was no effort to make the event different or more meaningful. It was not celebrated with feasting or music. There were no public announcements beyond the official record, no songs composed in honor of the bride, no gifts exchanged beyond the ceremonial objects used in the ritual. The marriage was not a beginning, but a continuation, a quiet step in a process that had no end in sight. The queens who entered these marriages did so without protest. They had been raised knowing that this was their role, that their life would follow a certain path, and that personal choice had little place in it. They accepted their duties without complaint, performed their rituals with calm precision, and appeared in the correct places at the correct times. They did not seek influence, nor were they given the means to exert it. Any effect they may have had on decisions was indirect, felt in small ways, through a pause in conversation, a glance, a suggestion made to a servant who then passed it to an official. These moments were not recorded, and their significance, if any, was never confirmed. Over time, the names of the rulers and queens became repetitive. The same first names appeared again and again: Ptolemy, Cleopatra, Arsinoe, Berenice, passed from one generation to the next like heirlooms. A man named Ptolemy would marry a woman named Cleopatra, and their son would be named Ptolemy, and when he grew up, he would marry another Cleopatra, and so on. The names were not tied to individual people, but to roles. Each new Ptolemy was expected to behave like the ones before him, to follow the same customs, to marry in the same way, to rule with the same quiet authority. There was no expectation of change, no desire for innovation. The temples built during this time showed images of the royal family standing in straight lines, each figure slightly smaller than the one before. The king stood at the front, the queen behind, the children arranged to the side. Their faces were calm, their hands held in the same position, their clothing identical in style. These carvings were made with great care, but they did not capture any sense of personality. No one smiled. No one looked to the side. They all faced forward, as if looking into a distant future they would never see. The inscriptions beneath them listed their names and titles, but nothing more. There were no descriptions of their thoughts, their feelings, or their private lives. When a ruler died, his wife did not remarry, at least not in any official way. She might take on the title of Queen Mother if her son became king, or she might retire to a quieter part of the palace, where her duties were reduced to occasional appearances and silent prayers. Her influence, if any, faded gradually, like the light at the end of the day. She would continue to be mentioned in temple records, her name included in offerings, but her presence in court life would diminish. She would walk the same halls, see the same walls, and follow the same routine until the end of her days. The practice of marrying within the family continued for many generations. It did not bring stability, nor did it prevent conflict. Brothers still fought brothers. Advisors still plotted. Power still shifted in quiet, unseen ways. But the marriages themselves remained unchanged. They were not meant to solve problems, but to maintain the appearance of order. As long as the rituals were followed, the correct people stood in the correct places, and the same names were passed down, the system could continue. By the time the years approached 200 before the Common Era, the tradition was still in place. The same rooms were used for ceremonies. The same words were spoken. The same robes were worn. There was no sign that this would ever change. The world outside was shifting, new powers were rising, new ideas were spreading, but within the palace, time moved slowly, if at all. The marriages of the Ptolemies were not events. They were repetitions. They were not beginnings. They were simply part of the long, quiet passage of years that marked the end of an age. The ceremonies that marked the union of a pharaoh and his chosen wife were not celebrations in the way that people today might understand the word. There was no music played for enjoyment, no dancing, no laughter or loud voices. The events were not held for the purpose of joy, but for the purpose of order. They were part of a long tradition of rituals meant to show that the king was following the proper path, that he was acting in harmony with the gods, and that the balance of the world was being maintained. The marriage was not a personal event, but a public act with religious meaning, carried out in the same way each time, with little variation from one century to the next. The ceremonies took place in a room within the palace that had been used for such purposes for many generations. It was not large, nor was it decorated with bright colors or gold. The walls were painted in soft tones, the floor was made of smooth stone, and the air was kept cool by the thickness of the walls. A small altar stood at one end of the room, made of dark wood and covered with a white cloth. On the cloth were placed a few simple objects, a lotus flower, a small jar of oil, a piece of linen, and a clay seal. These items were not chosen for their beauty, but because they had been used before, and their presence was required by custom. No one explained their meaning in detail, but everyone understood that they belonged there. The priest who led the ceremony arrived early in the morning, dressed in plain white linen with no ornaments or jewelry. He did not speak to anyone as he entered, but walked slowly to the altar, placed his hands on it for a moment, and then turned to face the door. He waited in silence until the couple arrived, accompanied by two attendants who did not enter the room. The pharaoh and his bride would stand before the altar, side by side, their eyes forward, their hands at their sides. They did not look at each other. They did not speak. There was no sign of emotion on their faces. They stood as they had been instructed, in the correct position, at the correct distance from the altar. The priest began to speak in a low, steady voice. The words were in Egyptian, though sometimes a phrase in Greek was added, spoken quietly and without emphasis. The text had been used for many years, passed down from one priest to the next, copied onto papyrus and memorized by heart. It spoke of balance, of duty, of the connection between the king and the gods, and of the need for continuity in the royal line. It did not mention love, happiness, or personal choice. It did not describe the future or make promises. It was not a vow, but a statement of fact, like a record of grain stored in a warehouse or the height of the Nile at flood season. As the priest spoke, he performed a series of small actions. He lifted the lotus flower and placed it on the left side of the altar. He opened the jar of oil and poured a single drop onto the linen. He pressed the clay seal into the palm of the pharaoh's hand and then closed the king's fingers around it. Each movement was slow and deliberate, done in the same way every time. There was no variation in the order, no improvisation, no attempt to make the moment feel special. The actions were not meant to be meaningful in themselves, but to fulfill a requirement, to complete a sequence that had to be followed exactly. The couple did not respond during the ceremony. They did not repeat any words, make any gestures, or take any active part. They were present, but passive, like statues placed in a temple courtyard. The priest did not ask for their agreement, nor did he look at them as he spoke. His eyes remained on the altar, his voice steady and even. The entire event lasted about 40 minutes, though it felt longer due to the lack of movement and sound. When the priest finished speaking, he stepped back, placed his hands at his sides, and bowed his head. The couple then turned and left the room in silence, followed by the attendants. The objects on the altar were left in place until the next morning, when they were removed and replaced with new ones of the same kind. After the ceremony, there was no gathering, no meal, no exchange of gifts. The queen returned to her rooms and resumed her usual routine. The pharaoh attended a meeting with advisors or inspected a construction project, as he would have done on any other day. The marriage was not discussed in the days that followed, except in official records. A scribe would write a short note stating that the event had taken place, listing the names of the couple, the date, and the name of the priest. This note would be stored in the palace archives, copied onto a stone tablet, and sometimes mentioned in temple inscriptions. The language was always formal and brief, with no additional details. The religious significance of the ceremony was never explained in full. It was understood that the king was a divine figure, connected to the gods, and that his marriage was part of his sacred duty. By taking a wife, especially one from his own family, he was preserving the purity of the royal bloodline and maintaining the balance between the human and divine worlds. The presence of the priest, the use of sacred objects, and the recitation of traditional words were all meant to align the event with the will of the gods. But these ideas were not discussed openly. They were simply accepted, like the rising of the sun or the flow of the river. Temples across the country sometimes held quiet observances on the day of a royal marriage, though these were not public festivals. A small offering would be made at dawn, a hymn would be sung in a low voice, and a lamp would be lit in the inner chamber. These acts were performed by a single priest or a small group of temple servants. No one from the general population was invited to attend. The events were not announced in advance, nor were they remembered afterward. They were part of the routine maintenance of the divine order, like cleaning the altar or refilling the oil in the lamps. The queen, after the ceremony, was expected to participate in religious duties more frequently. She would make offerings at the temple twice a month, stand beside the pharaoh during certain rituals, and appear in carvings that showed her presenting gifts to the gods. Her role was symbolic, but necessary. She represented the female aspect of the divine balance, the counterpart to the king's authority. She did not speak during these events, nor did she perform any actions beyond what had been practiced in advance. A senior priest would guide her steps if needed, but usually she only stood still, looking forward, her hands resting at her sides. Over time, the ceremonies changed very little. Even as new rulers came from distant lands, even as the language of the court slowly shifted, the form of the marriage ritual remained the same. The same objects were used, the same words spoken, the same movements performed. There was no effort to modernize or simplify the process. It was not meant to be efficient, but to be correct. The idea was that as long as the ritual was carried out exactly as it had been done before, the world would remain in balance, the gods would be satisfied, and the reign would continue without disruption. By the time the years approached 200 before the Common Era, the ceremonies were still held in the same room, with the same objects, and the same quiet dignity. The priest still spoke in a low voice. The couple still stood without moving. The altar still held the lotus, the oil, the linen, and the seal. Nothing about the event suggested that it was special or rare. It was simply another act in a long series of acts, repeated across centuries, each one blending into the next, like waves on a calm sea. The marriage was not a beginning. It was a continuation. And the ritual was not a performance. It was a habit, deeply settled, quietly observed, and never questioned. The practice of forming alliances through marriage with rulers from distant lands was not uncommon during the centuries between 700 and 200 before the Common Era, though it did not happen with great frequency. These unions were not the result of personal connections or emotional bonds, but of careful discussions held in quiet rooms over long periods of time. Officials from both sides would exchange messages, review the lineage of the proposed bride or groom, and consider the possible effects such a marriage might have on trade, borders, and military relations. The process was slow and required many steps, each one recorded in official documents that were copied and stored in dry rooms within the palace. There was no rush, no excitement, and very little public knowledge about the arrangements being made. When a decision was finally reached, it was treated as a matter of routine, not celebration. The marriage was seen as a formal agreement, similar to a treaty or a trade agreement, but expressed through the union of two individuals rather than written terms. The woman who was to be married to a foreign ruler was usually chosen from among the daughters or sisters of the current king, not because of her personality or abilities, but because her position made the alliance meaningful. She was prepared for her role over many months, taught the language of the country she would move to, instructed in the customs of the court, and shown how to behave during ceremonies. Her education was calm and repetitive, focused on obedience, silence, and correct appearance. The journey to the foreign land was long and uneventful. She traveled by boat along the river or by carriage across dry ground, accompanied by a small group of servants, priests, and guards. The route was planned in advance, with stops at designated points where food and shelter were provided. There were no delays, no unplanned events, and no opportunities for conversation with people outside the group. She remained inside the carriage or cabin during most of the trip, only stepping out at night to rest in rooms that had been prepared ahead of time. The people in the villages she passed through were not told who she was or why she was traveling. They saw only a covered vehicle, a line of quiet figures, and then silence once more. Upon arrival, there was no public welcome or festival. The foreign ruler would meet her at the edge of the city or at the palace gate, accompanied by a small group of officials. The greeting was brief and formal. No embraces, no words of affection, no speeches. She was led inside, shown to her rooms, and left to rest. The marriage ceremony took place a few days later, following the customs of the host country, though with small adjustments to include elements from her own tradition. A priest from each side would speak a few lines, objects of symbolic value would be placed on a table, and the couple would stand side by side, facing forward. The entire event lasted less than an hour and was attended by no more than 20 people. Life after the marriage followed a predictable pattern. The queen would take on the duties expected of her in the new court, appearing at ceremonies, making offerings at temples, and being present during official meals. She did not participate in decision-making or attend meetings of advisors. Her role was to represent the alliance, to be seen as part of the royal family, and to produce children if possible. Her daily routine was highly structured, with little variation from one day to the next. She rose at the same time each morning, ate the same meals, walked the same paths through the palace, and spoke only when spoken to. Her attendants were chosen by the court, not by her, and they reported on her behavior regularly. Communication with her homeland was limited and slow. Messages were sent on papyrus scrolls, sealed with wax, and carried by trusted messengers who took weeks to complete the journey. The replies, when they came, were brief and formal, containing no personal reflections or emotional expressions. They spoke of health, weather, and the status of certain rituals, nothing more. There was no mention of longing, loneliness, or difficulty adjusting. These feelings, if they existed, were not recorded. The official correspondence maintained the appearance of order and calm, as if everything was proceeding as expected. The political effects of these marriages were rarely immediate or noticeable. Alliances formed through marriage did not always lead to peace or cooperation. Trade agreements still had to be negotiated separately. Borders were still disputed. Armies still moved when conflicts arose. The presence of a foreign queen in the palace did not prevent war, nor did it guarantee loyalty between nations. The marriage was a symbol, not a solution. It showed that two rulers had agreed to a connection, but it did not enforce that agreement. Over time, some of these unions were quietly forgotten, the queen fading into the background, her name no longer mentioned in official records. The children born from these marriages were raised in the court of the foreign ruler, taught in the language of that land, and prepared for roles within its system. They were not raised as Egyptians, even if their mother was. Their education focused on the history, religion, and customs of the country they lived in. They learned little about Egypt, except as a distant place of origin. Their names were often local, adapted to the speech of the region. They did not visit their mother's homeland, and few ever saw it in person. Their identity was shaped by their environment, not by bloodline. Back in Egypt, the marriage was recorded in the palace archives, noted in temple inscriptions, and sometimes mentioned in religious offerings. The queen's name would appear in a list of royal women, followed by the name of the foreign ruler and the date of the union. The entry was brief, written in a steady hand, with no additional comments. There were no stories told about her life abroad, no accounts of her experiences, no reflections on the success or failure of the alliance. The fact of the marriage was enough. Its meaning, if any, was left unspoken. These diplomatic unions became less common as time passed. The rulers of Egypt found other ways to manage relations with distant powers, relying more on written agreements, trade, and military presence than on marriage. The idea of sending a royal woman to live in a foreign court became less appealing, especially as the balance of power shifted and Egypt's influence declined. The risks outweighed the benefits, and the effort required was no longer seen as worthwhile. The practice did not end suddenly, but faded gradually, like a path worn down by lack of use. When such marriages did occur in the later years, they followed the same format as before. The preparations were the same, the journey was the same, the ceremony was the same. Nothing was added, nothing was changed. The queen still traveled in silence, still stood beside a man she barely knew, still lived a life of quiet routine in a place that was not her home. There was no attempt to make the process more comfortable or meaningful. It was still treated as a duty, not a choice, and carried out with the same calm detachment that had marked earlier unions. By the time the years approached 200 before the Common Era, the idea of a royal marriage as a tool of diplomacy had lost much of its importance. The world was changing, new powers were rising, and old methods were no longer effective. The palaces of distant lands were filled with rulers who did not follow the same traditions, who did not see marriage as a sacred duty or a symbol of divine balance. Alliances were made and broken with little ceremony. The long journeys, the quiet ceremonies, the years of silence, none of it mattered as much as it once had. And so, the practice continued only in memory, in the inscriptions on stone, in the scrolls stored in dark rooms, in the names listed among the royal women who had left their homeland and disappeared into the silence of foreign courts. Their lives were not celebrated, not mourned, not remembered in stories. They existed in records, in positions, in roles. They were part of a system that valued stability over change, silence over speech, repetition over novelty. And when the last of these marriages took place, it did so without notice, without fanfare, without anyone remarking that it might be the final one. It was simply another event, recorded, completed, and filed away. The years that passed between 300 and 200 before the Common Era did not bring sudden changes to the royal court, but rather a slow and quiet fading of the old ways. There were no loud declarations, no ceremonies to mark the end of an era, no speeches about what had been lost. Instead, the traditions that had defined the lives of pharaohs for centuries began to lose their meaning, not with a collapse, but with a gradual silence. The marriages that once carried religious significance, political weight, and dynastic purpose became less frequent, less formal, and eventually less necessary. No one decided to end the practice. It simply stopped being repeated, like a path through sand that disappears when no one walks on it. The rulers of Egypt during this time still held the title of king or queen, still wore the symbols of office, and still appeared in carvings on temple walls. But their power was not what it had once been. Decisions that had once been made in the palace were now influenced, and sometimes made, by officials from a distant land called Rome. These men did not live in Egypt, but their letters arrived regularly, written on thin sheets of parchment and sealed with red wax. The replies were carefully worded, copied by scribes, and sent back with the same quiet urgency. The pharaohs still performed rituals, made offerings, and married according to custom, but the weight of these acts grew lighter with each passing year. They were done because they had always been done, not because they mattered. The marriages themselves became smaller, simpler, and less documented. There were fewer ceremonies held in the traditional room, fewer priests present, fewer objects placed on the altar. The lotus flower was sometimes missing. The jar of oil was not always opened. The clay seal was no longer pressed into the king's hand. The words spoken by the priest were shortened, spoken in a lower voice, as if even he no longer believed they needed to be heard. The queen still stood beside the ruler, still wore the white robe, still followed the same path through the palace, but her presence was no longer seen as essential. She was not mentioned as often in inscriptions, not shown as clearly in carvings, not listed in as many records. Some rulers chose not to marry at all. There was no rule requiring it, no law stating that a king must have a wife. The idea of producing an heir remained, but the method of securing the succession changed. A son might be named as successor without the mother being elevated to the status of queen. A nephew or cousin might be chosen, trained in the palace, and presented to the court without any ceremonial union taking place. The connection between marriage and power, once strong and unquestioned, began to weaken. The royal bloodline, once so carefully preserved through internal marriages, was no longer seen as the only source of legitimacy. Women who had once been brought into the royal family through marriage or birth found their roles reduced. The title of Queen Mother, once a position of quiet influence, became ceremonial, then disappeared from use. The rooms in the palace that had belonged to queens were left empty, their doors closed, their furnishings covered in cloth. The servants who had attended them were reassigned to other duties. The offerings made in their names at temples became less frequent, then stopped altogether. Their names were still written in some records, but without the honorifics, without the titles, as if they were no longer part of the sacred order. The temples, once filled with activity during royal events, became quieter. The priests still performed their daily rituals, still lit the lamps, still recited the old words, but with less frequency and less expectation that the gods were listening. The carvings on the walls continued to show images of kings and queens standing together, but these images were no longer updated. The last known depiction of a royal marriage was made in a small temple near the Delta, and even there, the figures were smaller than before, the lines less detailed, the paint applied unevenly. It was as if the artists no longer believed in the importance of what they were showing. In the cities and villages, people paid little attention to the changes at the top. Their lives were shaped by the price of grain, the level of the Nile, the arrival of tax collectors. The marriage of a king was not a matter that affected their daily routine. They did not gather in the streets when a new queen was named, nor did they stop working when a ceremony was held. The idea of the pharaoh as a living god still existed, but it was spoken of less often, and with less conviction. The stories of the old gods, once told by elders in the evenings, were repeated less frequently. New ideas, new languages, new customs arrived with traders, soldiers, and travelers from the north. The world was becoming larger, and Egypt's place in it was becoming smaller. The final rulers of the Ptolemaic line continued some of the old practices, but without the same sense of purpose. One queen, known by the name Cleopatra, married two of her brothers and later formed a connection with a ruler from Rome. This union was not a marriage in the traditional sense, nor was it carried out according to Egyptian custom. It was not blessed by priests, not recorded in temple inscriptions, not followed by the usual rituals. It existed in letters, in political agreements, in the movements of armies. When she died, there was no ceremony to mark the end of her reign, no formal transfer of power, no new king declared in the old way. The palace was occupied by Roman officials. The titles were no longer used. The line of pharaohs, unbroken for more than 3,000 years, simply ended. After that, the rooms where marriages had once been held remained unused. The altar was removed. The white robes were stored in wooden chests and forgotten. The scribes stopped writing the names of queens in the official lists. The carvings on the temple walls were left as they were, slowly worn down by wind and sand. No one tried to restore them. No one explained them to the younger generations. They became part of the landscape, like old trees or dry canals, present but not noticed. The idea of marrying within the family, of preserving royal blood, of aligning the king with the gods through ritual, all of it faded into silence. It was not rejected, not forgotten, not replaced. It was simply no longer repeated. The reasons for the marriages, political stability, religious duty, dynastic continuity, are no longer applied in the same way. The world had changed, slowly and without announcement, and the old system could not adapt. It did not break. It stopped. By the year 200 before the Common Era, the practice of royal marriage among the pharaohs had already lost its meaning. The last ceremonies had been performed without belief. The last queens had lived their lives in quiet obscurity. The last kings had ruled without full authority. And when the final records were made, they were written in a different language, stored in a different place, and used for different purposes. The long line of unions, stretching back through centuries, ended not with a cry, but with a breath, soft and unnoticed, like the closing of a door in an empty house.